Well, good morning. Hello. So hopefully my video and audio are working today. I've switched around computers and cameras and stuff. Unfortunately, last week, my Sunday coffee with everybody, the audio got all messed up. The audio pixies came in and tweaked my system. And so I've just pulled that one. But I'm looking at that as a way of motivating me to get onto YouTube because that's really something I have to be doing. So I'm thinking about how I'm going to respond to last week's treatment video. I'm actually going to start filming up a series on treatment for YouTube because I need to be up there, and I have all these series I need to be posting. But it's all the tech side, obviously, from last week. It's all the tech side that kind of holds me back. I'm a psychologist, and I find it annoying. So hopefully you'll see some YouTubes coming up in the next couple of weeks and next week or so here. I'm looking to film them up maybe this afternoon on various aspects of treating the pathology in the family courts. So this week, though, I want to just talk about where you families stand out there and where the change and solution and what's happening out there. I just finished my week of public consults. So the first week of every month, I hold public consults. Anybody can get a hold of me, contact me. And I don't know what they're going to want to talk about until I talk with them. So I run into a lot of different stories, different types of different situations that are pretty representative of what's happening out there for all of you. So I kind of know what you're facing and what you're looking at. And while I can tell you what the diagnosis is I have, it's a shared persecutory delusion and a factitious disorder imposed on another. And I can tell you what the treatment is: dialectic behavior therapy adapted for the courts, applied behavioral analysis, and some attachment therapy on the breach and repair from Edtronic. If the psychologist, if you don't have a psychologist to do those things, diagnose or treat the pathology in your family, then you're kind of stuck. And that's the current situation where we're at right now, is the psychologists that surround you are immensely ignorant and incompetent, and they don't care. And they're basically just exploiting you for the money. And I've spoken about that in other morning coffees, so I don't want to go too deeply into that. But that's the situation that a number of you are finding. Not only do you have to reorient and get the court orders and what's necessary to get a treatment approach for your family that fixes things, but then when you go to look for psychologists, the forensic psychologists say, I don't diagnose or treat pathology. And the ones who are treating it says, I don't diagnose or give you a treatment plan either. So, so you're running into some barriers with that. Part of the solution is my second opinion consultation to the mental health people, but that only becomes a solution if they are motivated to actually solve the problem, and they're not right now. So let me talk a little bit about that. That's what I want to talk a little bit about, is how we arrived here. So when I dropped down the rabbit hole about 10 years ago, back 2008-ish, I dropped down the rabbit hole to here, and I looked and saw the horrible state of professional psychology over here. And my first encounter was with the Gardnerian PAS people. So I was Googling around and found this term, parental alienation. And I started to look into what they're doing. And that's an awful pathology. That's an awful, awful diagnostic model for pathology. And so I said, I can understand why everybody rejected that, and it's so controversial. It's pretty bad. But then where are my psychologists? Where are the real psychologists out here? And mind you, like Bill Burnet's a psychiatrist, and we have Gottlieb's who's a social worker, and know-it-all's a social worker, and Baker's a researcher. There's no clinical psychologist among all the PAS people, prominent PAS people. So where are my psychologists? And when I looked to find them, what are they doing? They're the forensic psychologists. And what happened was, back in the 1980s, and I'm an old guy, I kind of remember it, there was a lot of conflict in the family courts around the divorce kind of situation. And your families are very professionally dangerous. The pathology is dangerous. It's very vengeful and retaliatory. And the legal system is dangerous for psychologists because it's very precise and we have to testify. And there's a whole human, an opposing counsel who wants to discredit us in any way possible, including slandering us and going after our license. And when you give a narcissistic, borderline, dark personality an attorney who wants to go after your license, that's an incredibly dangerous situation for clinical psychologists because we're trying to stop the pathology. So they want to retaliate against us and stop us from stopping them. Whereas the forensic psychologists who come here don't try to stop the pathology, they just let it manifest. So they're under no danger from the pathology because they're not stopping it. In addition, what's happened is because you have this subspecialty now, your own special psychologists, the forensic people, because you have them, any ethical complaints that go into the board or any practice complaints that go into the licensing board get referred to other forensic psychologists. And because they all do the same thing, they all just give themselves sort of carte blanche to ignore ethical standards and duty to protect and pretty much everything, application of knowledge. And so that was a risk management response from professional psychology to the dangerousness of the pathology over here. None of the other pathologies, ADHD, autism, eating disorders, trauma, depression, anxiety, nothing else has their own special psychologist, only you. And it was a risk management response to the dangerousness of the situation. The problem is, and high hopes in the beginning, oh, you're going to get really good care with, no, you didn't. It just went straight to the bottom on this. They exempted themselves from all ethical standards of practice, and the clinical psychologists all fled. So no clinical psychologist will work with you, and that's why there's no treatment. You don't have a treatment. There's no such thing as reunification therapy. That's just something they make up. Ask for a book. Say, give me the book that talks about reunification therapy. There is none. So there's no therapy over here. No behavioral therapy, no family systems therapy, no dialectic behavior therapy, nothing. Because all the clinical psychologists have left. All the treatment people. We haven't been here in 40 years. So when you reach out to the clinical people, they're not competent in working in the family courts. So actually, they shouldn't come back because they don't know the pathology over here, that no one has been working over here for 40 years. The psychologists who have been here for 40 years are the forensic psychologists who are immensely ignorant and incompetent. And so you're kind of stuck with your own group. And the phrase I use is that forensic psychology is a failed model in service delivery to a vulnerable population, and that we need clinical psychology to return to court-involved professional practice. So that's the situation in a nutshell. Now, as I was coming in and looking at this, I'm doing my analysis of what the problems here. So I see the failures in forensic psychology, the failure in the ethical standards, 2.04, 2.01, boundaries of competence. And then I look at the awful Gardner's PAS. Now, the traditional approach of changing the field from within and working with these people, well, that's not going to work because of something called the homeostatic balance. Homeo, the same, static, it doesn't change. It's a same that never changes. So the homeostatic balance has to do with how systems work. And what happens is the system, the dysfunctional system, is stable with the symptom present. So the symptom is stabilizing the dysfunctional system. So you can't remove the symptom because the entire system is going to fight you because it needs the symptom. And the symptom in this case is the ignorance and incompetence of the psychologists. So we can't remove that symptom because the whole system's going to collapse if we do. And so on the one side, the forensic psychologists are resisting the application of knowledge because I'm telling them, do a risk assessment. Are these symptoms? And they say, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not going to assess for a possible delusional disorder. I'm not going to assess for false attachment pathology. I'm not going to assess for child psychology. I'm just not going to do it. That's what they say. They essentially put their head in the sand because the moment they do, they're going to find out, yeah, it is a shared persecutory delusion. Yeah, it is a factitious disorder imposed on another. Yeah, we do have dark personality and narcissistic borderline pathology in the family. And it is child psychological abuse. And they're not diagnosing it and haven't been diagnosing it for 40 years. So not only in that 40-year span where you've been isolated from psychology, not as only has that kept all the clinical people and your treatment people away, so we don't have any treatments for you, it has also created this bubble where we have all these false experts in forensic psychology who are expert in nothing. They're not experts in attachment or delusional pathology or factitious disorder or child abuse, nothing. They're just experts in the child custody evaluations they do that cost $20,000 to $40,000 and solve nothing. They're experts in financially exploiting you. So if I come in and say, we need to change to clinical, they're going to all lose their jobs. There's no call for a forensic custody evaluation if we can get a 6 to 8 week clinical diagnostic assessment that diagnoses and puts it on a treatment plan and solves it. So they're not motivated to solve the pathology. They're just motivated to continue to do the same thing of exploiting you for your money because that's their career. That's how they're paying their house payment, car payment. The moment we move to a clinical diagnosis, they're no longer competent in attachment, personality disorders, family systems therapy, any of this, because they're a forensic psychologist. So there's no hope of me entering that system. That system's going to be shut to me. And so I'm not applying to talk to the AFCC at their conventions, or I did. I mean, I did my due diligence. They were aware. I did my job. They're aware of what the pathology is. They're just not motivated to solve it. My favorite saying, don't try to teach a pig to sing. It just frustrates you and annoys the pig. And so I should not have to educate the psychologist to have a professional level discussion with them. And holy cow, a patient should never have to educate the doctor about the pathology. But that's what you guys have to do. You have to go in and educate your doctors about what the pathology is and how to diagnose it. So that's just phenomenally bad in terms of professional standards of practice. And why is that? That was my next question. Why is it? How did it get so low? Well, who's supposed to keep the standards up and protect consumers from incompetence? That's the licensing boards. So why aren't they enforcing the ethical standards? 2.01, 2.04, 9.01. Why aren't they enforcing ethical standards of practice? Oh, because all the referrals from families, from court-involved families that go into the licensing board, get shunted over to the forensic psychologist because it's a subspecialty practice. So the forensic psychologists who are doing the custody evaluations and then get on the licensing board, and so they're just reviewing their own and they exempt themselves from all standards of practice. So boom, it went to the bottom. And that's what we have over here. So it's a failure of the licensing boards, essentially, because of this whole special psychologists that you've been given. And my phrase on that is going forward is I'm out here in enforcing ethical standards, basically. Doing reports on other mental health reports that highlight the ethical and failure and duty to protect obligations evident in their reporting. And hopefully those will be going into licensing boards. I suggest all parents, when warranted, when they're not competent, be doing what they're doing. 2.01, 2.04, they didn't apply knowledge. 9.01 is not based on information and techniques sufficient to substantiate their findings. File a licensing board complaint on those three standards and get the licensing boards to start openly refusing to investigate violations of ethical standards and violations of duty to protect obligations. Eventually, a few parents will have the resources and the situation available that they'll file malpractice lawsuits, and we'll get a malpractice lawsuit that will be victorious, will win, and we'll get a tear us off range kind of ruling that says, no, we need to, the courts and families in the courts deserve a proper risk assessment for possible child abuse. And boom, all of a sudden, we have standards of practice again, because the courts have come in and said, you need to be, malpractice is not acceptable, because the licensing boards are saying malpractice is acceptable. They're not protecting the consumers. They should be. They're not protecting the consumers from incompetent psychologists. They're protecting the incompetent psychologists from the consumers who they damage and hurt. So the licensing boards are a twisty thing right now. So that was my initial entry in seeing what's happening with the forensic psychologists and saying, So I know at that point that we need to get standards of practice back here, basically, fundamentally, and that forensic psychology needs to leave their failed model of service delivery. They don't diagnose anything, and they say they don't. We don't diagnose. There's even in their own standards not to use diagnostic labels, and they don't treat anything. They say we do something different. We're not doing treatment. I'm doing something different. I don't diagnose it. I don't treat. Well, if you don't identify what the problem is and you don't fix it, what good are you? You are no good. There's no purpose to a forensic psychologist. They don't diagnose what the pathology is. They don't identify what the problem is, and they don't fix it. They don't treat it. What do? They take $20,000 to $40,000 for 6 to 9 months of delay when it's possible child abuse, and you're allowing the child abuse to go on for 6 to 9 months while you dawdle around in your balloon, puffy, inflated custody evaluation. And then when you return your custody evaluation in 6 to 9 months, we still need another assessment, for a diagnostic assessment, to see if there's child abuse there, because you didn't diagnose child abuse. So even after your assessment, custody evaluation, we still need another assessment. That is immense malpractice. Another assessment for child abuse, because in the 6 to 9 months of your assessment, you did not assess for child abuse, which is one of the two primary differential diagnoses. So what I'm running into, what you're running into with the forensic people, is when you say Dr. Childress and you give them my material and stuff, they say no, and it's no, it's controversial, and no, it's and they avoid adopting professional standards of practice. They avoid applying family systems or delusional or DSM thought disorders, because if they do apply it, then they admit that for the last 40 years they haven't been, and all of a sudden they'll be talking about delusional thought disorders and factitious disorders and child psychological abuse. That's the key diagnosis, when for the last 40 years they haven't been diagnosing that. And so all the forensic people who have been here for 40 years are the worst imaginable. They have failed in their duty to protect. They have violated standards 2.04 and 2.01 for 40 years, their entire career. So they can't admit the change. And so that's just a locked situation for them. So I've been interested to see what they're going to do about it. And we found out what they're going to do about it. The other side, though, when I arrived, is you had people who were supposedly your allies, these Gardnerian PAS people, but that was just a bad model of her pathology, created by a psychiatrist, not a psychologist. No research base to it. He didn't apply knowledge. Gardner skipped the step of diagnosis. He gave himself permission not to apply knowledge, not to know knowledge, and came up with his own version of a new pathology. And no, that's not how we do things in psychology. We just don't make up stuff. But he got everybody fighting. And that was the result of his unethical practice and problematic professional practice of Gardner, is that he led everybody into fighting for the last 40 years rather than applying knowledge, getting a diagnosis, and fixing it, treating it. And so that was a misstep. But at least they're saying, the Gardnerian people, Burnett and others, are saying they're your allies and they want to solve parental alienation. So I thought to myself, okay, these are your allies. When I give them the proper diagnosis for this, of a shared delusional disorder and cross-generational coalition and everything, they'll join me and say, yeah, hey, Dr. Childress figured it out. It's child abuse and it's shared persecutory. And they didn't. Okay, that was back 2013 or something. And because they're in the same position as the forensic people. If I'm right, which I am, which is shared persecutory delusion and the cross-generational coalition and the child psychological abuse diagnosis, if that's right, then there is no parental alienation. They're wrong. And so they have to shift over to an attachment-based model of parental alienation, ABPA, which is the shared persecutory delusion. But now that makes me the expert because I'm the expert in delusional thought disorders and attachment pathology and child abuse and factitious disorder. And they're not. They're not an expert in anything, but they're made up parental alienation. They're not an expert in attachment. They're not an expert in child abuse. They're not an expert in delusional thought disorders. They're not an expert in factitious disorder. And so they want to hold on to being an expert. But that means they need parental alienation as a construct. Otherwise, they're not an expert in anything. So I was hoping that they would be professionals and they would recognize I'm right and move over and adopt, and I would get access to their journal, American Journal of Family Therapy. I could start publishing into that journal, and we could begin to change the forensic psychology landscape by bringing knowledge to it. But the response of the Gardner PAS people, led by Bill Burnett, was to completely ignore Dr. Childress. They're not going to mention me or mention my work or mention anything about shared delusional disorders or factitious disorder or any of the child psychological abuse. Nothing about Dr. Childress. And they'll show me that I have to accept parental alienation in order to get their participation, or else they're just going to ignore me and shun me from the professional community. Ah, geez Louise. So we can't have parental alienation because that just continues the controversies. No such thing. So that has to go. That has to die. Just like forensic psychology, we can't have that. It has to die. We need to get treatment back and actual diagnoses and actual therapies. And I kept trying to explain parental alienation has to die. The moment it does, we have the solution. But they don't want the solution. They want to remain experts in something, parental alienation. Now that put me in a difficult position back in 2013, 2015, as they are selecting to simply ignore my work and ignore everything about that. That's going to delay us about 5 years, at least, in getting the solution. So we're going to lose a lot of kids during that period. It's not going to stop the coming knowledge and the application of knowledge, because the real battle is with the forensic people. Forensic psychology needs to go. This Gardner people are just a sideshow. But instead of joining me with against the forensic craziness, they instead tried to undermine me and tried to undermine the solution going forward. And they did for 5 years. And so it was very painful for me to watch the continuing destruction and parents continuing to go into this parental alienation into the courts. And I'm saying, don't use the name, don't use it. don't use parental alienation, but parents are continuing to be seduced by the Gardner PAS expert people. But I couldn't fight with them, because if I say, why aren't you acknowledging the truth of what I'm saying? They're going to say, oh, you're just trying to make it about you, and it's all about Dr. So they're going to try to make it like a narcissistic thing on my part. If I try to assert, why aren't you discussing my work? Why aren't you discussing a shared delusional disorder or foundations or anything? So I basically had to endure because my focus is on the forensic people. So I'm continued on that course and just let the destruction occur for the last 5 years. So I would put the last 5 years of families that we lost here directly at the feet of all the Gardner people, because of their failure to be competent, standard 2.01, their failure to apply the established psychological knowledge, standard 2.04, unethical practice, and failure in the duty to protect. And that you can even see it now with them, as they're still continuing with the parental alienation syndrome. Burnett has still got his parental alienation syndrome thing going, and he'll still come on. And look what they did after the DSM-5. They are encouraging the diagnosis of parent-child relational problem. They never talked about the child abuse diagnosis that came with DSM-5. We got a child psychological abuse diagnosis and parent-child relational conflict. They chose that diagnosis to emphasize, parent-child relational conflict. I chose a child abuse one. I go, holy cow, we got a child abuse diagnosis. Let's bring that forward. It's a shared delusional disorder, makes it a child abuse. Oh, but they can't do that because they're not acknowledging the shared delusion. They're pretending it just doesn't exist, the shared burden. And so that doesn't get them the child abuse. And so they're trying to nurse their own little thing going forward. And you can see that even now. And I'll see them occasionally up on the web doing their seduction of parents, come to parental alienation funhouse and be turned into a donkey. So I have a lot of problems with them. I believe they're spreading medical misinformation on the internet. I believe they're harming parents. I believe they are degrading the quality of professional practice in the family courts. The Gardner PAS people, with their PAS proposal, are degrading the quality of professional practices in the family courts, and they should stop. But they don't, because they want to be experts in something. And so we'll move beyond them. What happened, so that shows you what the pathogen is going to do, because that's the pathogen on one side is the Gardner people. I'm going to call it pathogen on one side is the Gardner people. Pathogen on the other side is the forensic psychologist. Notice it's kind of interesting that both of those arose right at the same time in the 1980s. Oh God. I'm going forward, my future APA presentation and talk is going to be that both of those were a creation of a pathology. Those are both pathological. Gardner's PAS is pathological, and a creation of the pathology, and forensic psychology as a field is a creation of the pathology. By making itself so dangerous, we had to take a risk management response, and then they swooped in and isolated this group of parents away from rescue and away from everybody, so it could abuse its victim. And its victim is not the child, by the way. The victim is the spouse. This is being driven by spousal abuse. So this is spousal psychological abuse using the child as a weapon, and then in weaponizing the child, they create such serious pathology in the child, it becomes child psychological abuse. But the victim on this is the spousal abuse. And so they've isolated the victim from rescue, and then do all these sorts of things to keep to destabilize the targeted parent and keep them from rescue. So I put the Gardner people back as sort of a sideshow and stayed on my course, and have been working, and then went to the AFCC and went to the APA. Then COVID went through and kind of took me off my time frame a little bit. But now I'm in the family courts. I have a consulting practice where I review custody evaluations and other mental health reports, GAL reports, and everybody. Apply knowledge. I don't have an opinion. I apply the knowledge. I can tell you what the knowledge is I'm applying to the symptom evidence. and basically coming up with the state. We need a proper risk assessment for possible child abuse, and these are the issues that all the data says are a problem. The other thing I'm doing as part of my practice is ongoing consultation to the mental health people. And that's a more effective use of my time and knowledge, is if the mental health people want to access my knowledge for second opinion, then we can get a proper assessment and accurate diagnosis. Because none of the mental health people around you know how to do it. They don't. Some of my clinical people kind of do, but they don't work in the family courts. So my schizophrenia people know how to diagnose delusional thought disorders, but they don't work with family courts and family conflict. My attachment people know how to, diagnose attachment pathology, but they work with infants and young children. They don't work in the family courts either. So none of the clinical people with the knowledge, dialectic behavior therapists, borderline personality, working with borderline, they don't work in the family courts. They work with borderline person. Who works in the family courts? Forensic psychologists. That's the only one, and they don't know anything, or they're incompetent. So I've just kept going. And what I'm doing, and what an attachment-based model of parental alienation, ABPA, what that does is it disrupts the homeostatic balance. Homeo, the same, static never changes. Well, this is change. I'm forcing them to acquire new information, to deal with new information. This is a possible persecutory delusion. This is a factitious disorder imposed on another. This is child psychological abuse. And the moment they look, it's going to disrupt the entire system of exploitation and isolation and ignorance. Because now the ignorance is gone. They have to apply knowledge, and there is actual knowledge there. And so that disrupts the system, which is exactly what has to happen. And then as the system restabilizes, you can take out the symptom and help guide the restabilization. And that's how you change systems. The first thing you have to do is disrupt the homeostatic balance, and recognizing that every aspect of the system will fight you on that. So the forensic fight me, the Gardner people fight me, the parents fight me, the courts fight me, the legal people fight me. Everybody's fighting to keep things the same and to keep the ignorance in the family courts. Because if we take the ignorance out of the psychologists, everything's going to collapse. There is no professional competence over here. Zero. None of the psychologists working in the family courts know what they're doing, nor do any of the clinical psychologists, because they've avoided the family courts for 40 years. So the entire system is going to collapse. Now, what I've done, apply an attachment-based model of parental alienation, ABPA. It's not some sort of new theory. I've just simply applied knowledge. What it is a stepping stone for the ignorant psychologists, the forensic people. If they want to get back on track, it gives them a scaffolding for their ignorance, because I know all the knowledge. And so just do these things and you will get an accurate diagnosis. 3 diagnostic indicators. I gave you 12 additional associated clinical signs. Do the parenting practices rating scale with a targeted parent. If you do those things, you will be able to accurately diagnose the pathology 100% of the time. Let me give you an idea of just how immensely ignorant they are. As if you're explaining to them what the diagnosis is, they're immensely ignorant. If I have to explain to them about the diagnosis and the pathology, they are immensely ignorant. I should not have to educate a psychologist in order to have a professional level discussion with them. That should never happen. And yet it is. So how ignorant? A child does not reject a parent, ever, ever. So they're coming in, they're getting this child rejecting a parent's symptom, and they're saying there might be justified estrangement. No, there is never a justified estrangement for the attachment system, because the attachment system is a primary motivational system of the brain, and it is a goal-corrected motivational system, which means it always maintains the goal of forming an attachment bond to the parent. Always. It never seeks to detach from a parent, because there's a predator out there who's more than happy to eat that child. And so the pathology does not, I lost a little screen here. The pathology, the child does not reject a parent. And so one of the things I've recently done, I went out and bought another one of this Attachment in Adulthood, second edition. Michelin and Shaver. I know Shaver from all his research and work. And so Attachment in Adulthood. Now, I know the attachment system. Holy cow, I've read so much about this and worked with it personally in my clinic and all these sorts of things. But I'm going back to study up again because we've reached that point. And so I'm starting to do my underlines. Let's see, can you see that there? It says the set goal of the attachment system. Now look how early this is in the book. The set goal of the attachment system. And what the set goal means is that the attachment system has this goal of forming a secure attachment bond to the parent. That's the goal. And if it runs into problem parenting, it changes how it tries to get that goal, but it always maintains the set goal of forming an attachment bond to the parent. So in response to bad parenting, the attachment system changes how it tries to do, and it creates a insecure attachment in the child. So problematic parenting creates an insecure attachment in the child that more strongly motivates the child to bond to the parent. So if I'm getting an argument from these stupid forensic psychologists that the child has some sort of, that the targeted parent is a bad parent and that's justified somehow, the rejection. If the targeted parent is a bad parent, the attachment system will motivate the child to more strongly bond to that parent, more strongly motivated to bond to that parent, not less. That's a false symptom because it never happens. And so when I get over to treatment, last week I talked about applied behavioral analysis. If there's no cue for the child's rejecting behavior, because it's not a true behavior. The child should be motivated to bond to that parent. If there's a problem in the parent, that the stimulus is creating the protest behavior, you change that parent. You change stimulus control. You change the parent's behavior, you will see a corresponding change in the child. Okay? So that's what you do. But you change the parent's behavior, the child just stays exactly where they are, because the child's behavior isn't under the stimulus control of the parent. It's a false pathology. It's under the stimulus control of the alliance and the psychological control of the other parent. So I can get there exactly through behavioral psychology as well, get to exactly the same conclusion. It's a false pathology, a false rejection. Applied behavioral analysis, look at the cue structure of it. Or I can simply know how the brain works and say the child never rejects a parent. That's not how the system works. The camera, that's not how the system works. Brain. Now, potentially, possibly, if somebody says, well, what about really severe child abuse? Wouldn't the child reject that parent? Actually, no. But okay, let's say really severe child abuse, the child will reject that parent. I'll just entertain that for argument right now. Then that's the parenting practices rating scale. Rate the targeted parent 4 levels. Level 1 is abusive. Level 2 is really seriously bad, just short of abusive. Level 3 is normal range problematic. Level 4 is normal range healthy. If the targeted parent is level 3 or 4, normal range parenting, then they are not the severely abusive parent that could override the set point of the attachment system. Children do not reject parents ever. You know who rejects? Spouses. Spouses reject spouses for being inadequate spouses. Inadequate parents create an insecure attachment that more strongly motivates the child to bond to the parent. So how do I have a child now who's rejecting an inadequate parent. That's a spousal attachment system. How does a child acquire a spousal attachment system? Through the psychological control, enmeshment, and influence of a pathological parent. So again, I have just really clear symptom evidence that that child's being psychologically controlled by the parent, because that's not an authentic attachment system. That child doesn't reject a parent, and that's a normal range parent. The child, even if it's a bad parent, the child should have an insecure attachment. So that's just knowledge of attachment system. And this is an attachment pathology. And they don't know the attachment system, and that's how ignorant they are, that they believe that it's possible for a child to reject a parent. The other feature is when you have a breached attachment bond, you have an immense grief response. Watch Ed Tronick's still face study. When the mom goes still face, that child goes into a great deal of distress from being in that breach with their mom, the attachment bond on that. It's pretty severe. It's heart-wrenching to watch these kids and that's just going still face. So a child losing an attachment bond to a parent is going to be an immense grief response. So my question would be to all the psychologists, where's the child's grief? The child's saying, I don't need a parent. There's no grief there. That's not an authentic attachment system. And it just kills me. And then you can look at persecutory delusions and mental status exam of thought and perception. I'm going to be recommending we bring over the brief psychiatric rating scale, item 11, of that unusual thought content. We can give a 1 to 7 rating on the persecutory delusion. If the person has full conviction, that's at least a rating of 4. And the definition in the BPRS for full conviction is acts on the false belief. So if the child and the parent act on the false belief of supposed persecution, that the child is being malevolently treated in some way, then that at least a 4. Then you look at functional impairment and preoccupation. In this case, functional impairment, severe impairment in the families, and we're up to at least a 5, which is a moderately severe persecutory delusion on the BPRS. Rate it. There you go, you got BPRS. Do you have a single forensic psychologist rating anything on the BPRS? No. Do you have a single forensic psychologist doing the Roberts apperception test for children to find out what's going on with the kid? No. They just do whatever they want, and they solve nothing, and they're giving them PIs, but not the Roberts or not the BPRS. It's incredible. But the moment they start doing that, they're going to admit that they've been doing it bad and wrong and colluding with the child abuse and failing in their duty to protect for the last 40 years. And the longer they've been here, the longer that means they've been in malpractice and ignorant, incompetent, and unethical. So the forensic psychologists are in a lot of trouble. I've been kind of watching how they're going to handle it. And they're going to handle it the same way that the Gardner people did. They're going to put their head in the sand and just kind of ignore it. It's going into denial. So the pathogen has a very simple defensive structure. It just denies. Nope, doesn't happen. Nope, doesn't exist. Trump lost the election. Nope, Trump didn't lose the election. I'm like, whoa, yeah, he did. But that's not going to last for the forensic psychologist. What I anticipate going to happen here is parents are increasingly going to ask or be seeking a clinical diagnostic assessment for possible delusional disorder, possible child abuse. And they're not going to find anybody who can do that. And so the court system will not have the ability, they're not going to be getting information from professional psychology about child abuse because parents just can't get it. They can get a court order for the assessment, but they can't find a psychologist to do the assessment. In addition, I don't think the parents are going to be wanting forensic child custody evaluations for $20,000 to $40,000 in 6 to 9 months. They're going to be wanting a clinical diagnostic assessment for $5,000 in 6 to 8 weeks. So the money's going to dry up for forensic evaluations, and the money instead is going to go over to doing clinical diagnostic assessments. And if you put money somewhere, somebody's going to come in and start to do it. I've made it real simple. 3 diagnostic indicators, 12 associated clinical signs, parenting practices, rating scale. It's really easy to do a clinical diagnostic assessment. Moment you come over to Childress and ABPA, piece of cake. Or if you don't want to use ABPA, do a mental status exam of thought and perception, and look at the attachment networks, cross-generational coalition, and is it a factitious disorder, false attachment pathology imposed on a child? So you can apply the knowledge directly, or you can use my work as a scaffold up to it, because I know all the knowledge that's needed. And so people can come back, and they can always consult with me. And that's why parents, you find somebody, a dialectic behavior therapist, somebody who's a clinical person willing to come back and understand the pathology and actually work with these families and the child abuse, and they want to consult with me. That's the second half of my practice, is doing mental health consultation to professionals who want to solve the pathology. Otherwise, I'm doing report analysis on the ones who didn't, and documenting their unethical and problematic professional practices. So that's kind of sort of the zone of which we're at now, is that the system is, in my view, is going to be collapsing, that it's just going to be an absolute mess. So parents aren't going to be able to find clinical diagnostic assessments, and the forensic psychologists are going to flee as it becomes more dangerous over here. You might find a few of the forensic people, the earlier ones in the field, who will begin to apply knowledge because they're early and can do it without all the baggage of why haven't you been doing it for the last 20 years. The old school forensic people, once things shift, they're going to hit the shame domain that is equivalent to what the Gardnerians will face on this, that they've been colluding with child abuse for the last 40 years, and that'll be interesting. When I get onto YouTube, one of my goals, I'm going to do a lot of little seminar series kind of things all over the place, but one of them I'm looking to do, if I have to, is VITA education for attorneys on how to read a professional VITA and how to attack a professional VITA in the family courts. And I'm going to be using people's VITAs. So let's see who these people are, because the issue out here is exploitation of a vulnerable population. So let's bring up your VITA and take a look and see who you are. Now, I'm not going to criticize necessarily the VITA. We'll just take a look at it and see where is their background in attachment, where is their background in delusional thought disorders, where is their attachment in child therapy, where is their attachment, where is their background in child abuse, and so what have they been doing for their career. And so I'll be grabbing and putting them up there. That should be fun, which excuse me, but it's going to become a mess. It's going to become a mess, is my opinion. But I suspect just market forces, once we dry up money from one place, and that's why, parents, you're more powerful than you know. You've got the money. If you put money into forensic evaluations, that's where it is. If you dry it up, there's no money there, and so they all go away. And then if you put money over here in treatment, somebody's going to start coming into the treatment. So we will get the solution that it'll crack open at some point, because it's true. It is a factitious disorder imposed on another. It is true. It's a shared persecutory delusion. It's child psychological abuse. That's true. It's a narcissistic, borderline dark personality creating pathology in the child for secondary gain of manipulating the court's decisions on child custody. That's true. So take a look at it, and yep, there's a diagnosis. Diagnosis guides treatment. We need a child protection response. This is not about child custody. It's about child protection. Child custody is easy peasy. It's either two possible models. Either it's a variant of a 50-50 shared custody, or one parent gets primary school week, the other parent gets every other weekend and a day during the week. Those are basically your two variants. It's not complicated on the custody. If there's distance involved, one parent gets school year, the other parent gets some vacation time. 3 models based on context. It's not difficult. What makes it difficult is the severe attachment pathology in the child. That could be child abuse towards a targeted parent. Okay, let's get that assessed, but let's get the differential assessed too, that it's a factitious disorder imposed on another for manipulative secondary gain. What I anticipate is going to happen, that now that we've reached this point, is that things are going to collapse around the family courts. One of the things I'm doing right now is I'm educating like people one at a time in these first of the month public consults. And why am I just not like educating a bunch of judges all the time? My reports go in and educate a judge one at a time about what the pathology is. I could be telling all the judges about this. So that's going to happen at some point. The judges are going to invite me up and say, Dr. Childress, would you tell us what the pathology is here and what we need to do about it? At some point, I would hope the psychologists start to listen and say, oh, let's ask Dr. Childress what to do about this, or start doing what I suggest they do on assessing the pathology. Is there an attachment pathology towards a normal range parent? Do you find 5 narcissistic personality disorder traits displayed by the child, or a phobic anxiety towards a parent? And is there a persecutory delusion in the child towards a normal range parent? If you've got those symptoms, there's only one thing that causes it. And you say, well, let's rule out the targeted parent as being abusive. Parenting practices rating scale to do that. We rule out that parent, and you got these 3 symptoms. I even gave you 12 associated clinical signs, and you get about 4 to 6 to those. That's support. You get 6 to 9, that's substantial support. You get above 9 of those 12 clinical associated clinical signs, that's substantial. And with the whole 3 diagnostic indicators, with those 12 associated signs, it's basically I'm calling my home run shot to left field, but I'm calling it in section 203, row 104, seat 12 in the cup holder. I'm predicting that you're going to find word choices, sentences, various features about, because it is so consistent. It's a trauma pathogen. And that's what science is. You have a model, you make a prediction, gather the evidence, and see if the prediction holds. So start gathering the evidence. Start asking the mental health people to complete the diagnostic checklist and the parenting practices rating scale. They'll say no. They say, I don't know. Then write it on a napkin. Does the child have an attachment? Or does the child reject a normal range parent? Does the child have these 5 narcissistic symptoms towards a parent? Does a child have a specific phobia towards a parent? Does a child have a persecutory delusion towards a parent? Answer those 4 questions. No, I'm not going to answer the questions. I'm not going to tell you what your child's symptoms are. These are the worst psychologists, the worst doctors ever. Imagine going into a doctor and saying, doctor, this hurts. What's going on? The doctor says, I'm not going to tell you. Just here's your treatment, but I'm not going to tell you what the problem is. Unbelievable. So I've just finished up my week of public consults. Now I'll be going in and starting to write reports for clients and stuff. And one of the things about you people is there's a lot of you, and there's only one of me. And look at me, I'm an old guy. I want to be like retiring out here in beautiful Pacific Northwest. I don't want to be working 24/7 because of the demand that's out there. So this is going to be an interesting negotiation of my time as I kind of see if I can have a life independent from all the demands of my time. So what I'm figuring doing here, I'm going to have another month in December where I'll see clients during the first week of the month. I think that's pretty full at this point. Then I'm going to take January off and just kind of catch up. Then I'll see clients on February and March, take April off, March, take April off, and see, May as well. And so I'll start taking months off of my public consults, and we'll see what happens about going forward. I'm looking to get maybe some additional resources in for consultation help to parents out there as I kind of become less available. Hopefully I can get you more services that are available and stronger. At some point, though, the system will break. The legal system will break because it can't find psychologists to do what it wants as a diagnostic assessment. Is there child abuse? And you won't find a psychologist who's able to answer that question. So the legal system will break. And so they'll want to fix that. At some point, the forensic psychology system will break. That there'll be malpractice lawsuits and massive number of ethics boards complaint for all the forensic people, 2.01, 2.04, 9.01. And so the forensic people, and there'll be no demand for them, and that'll start to break. The licensing boards will crack as to why aren't the licensing boards enforcing ethical standards of practice? Get the legislature on them, and that'll start to crack. The parents will be, you're going to be in a tough situation. There'll be no solution for you because the mental health system is fundamentally broken. And that's just the way it is. There's no solution. You can't get a diagnosis and you can't get treatment for child abuse because no psychologists are here that can do that. That'll be interesting. At some point, the American Psychological Association has to get back in here and clean this up. And so that's our remedy 3 of the petition to the APA, is to get the APA in here to do a couple of presidential conferences or something to figure out what's happening in the family courts. And so that will some self-reflective insight and to reevaluate our risk management response. It should not be by isolating the families. It should be by bringing clinical psychology in, and then we're going to have to keep ourselves safe as clinical psychologists. And there's a way to do that. That's what I'm doing. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm safe. So just walk where I walk, do what I do, stay on diagnosis, stay on treatment, stay away from custody, and you'll be safe over here. Apply knowledge and you'll be safe. And so that the APA will hopefully come in to solve it. Potentially the courts with a malpractice lawsuit can set standards across the board. The other thing that I'm recommending, and I suspect it'll come at some point, is a pilot program for the family courts, and ABPA/High Road pilot program for the family courts. 5 years ago, I probably could have run it. At this point, I'm thinking by the time it gets forward, I'm not going to be available as a clinical director for it. So at this point, I'll just be a consultant to whoever decides to run it. I'd recommend it out of California. I'd like to see the California legislature fund a pilot program for the family courts with Stanford Forensic Psychiatry as the PI on it, and a second site in Southern California with UCLA, Pepperdine, and Alliant University. The Southern California site would work up the treatment protocol for the family courts. The Northern California site, in collaboration with UCLA Neuropsychiatric, would work up the diagnostic protocol for the family courts. And then we had Dorcy right into the transition period, so she could do half the high roads and then teach the researchers how to do half the high road. And so transfer the protocol into the healthcare and research systems. And at which point she becomes like a queen goddess of trauma. So that's what she gets for her intellectual property, is become the queen goddess of trauma recovery and rights to the high road trademark. But then everybody can start researching these 4-day workshop approaches and applying their own model. The first people in, the first legislature and university, whether it's Pennsylvania or Florida or Texas or New York, whoever, the first ones in get naming rights. So it would be like the California Stanford protocol for the family courts. And then you have law schools at both places that could develop the legal arguments for the diagnostic protocol and the treatment protocol. We need to stop fighting around these kids. That's not productive. That's not healthy for these kids to go on for 5-6 years of fighting and destroyed families. We need a diagnosis and a treatment. So let's call in our best universities. Everybody's been gone for 20 years, so let's get them back. Acknowledge they need to come back, acknowledge we need to fix a lot of stuff, get the universities in, develop the assessment protocol, develop the treatment protocol, develop the legal arguments underneath that. When we have that all structured, we don't really need the family law attorneys as much, because pro se parents can do it, because all the court system and all the mental health people know what they're doing. And so it's a system to solve things. We do it early intervention, and we just keep escalating up the consequences based on how severe the pathology keeps going. And so there's a lot of solutions out there. They will be coming, but only after the homeostatic balance is disrupted and there's destruction. And that's unfortunate. I tried my best to give them the opportunity to make a more gradual change, but the Gardner people said, nope, sticking our head in the sand. The forensic psychologist said, nope, sticking our head in the sand. So we're headed down to a destructive period of time. The statement is, Phoenix will rise from the ashes, but in order for the Phoenix to rise, there must be ashes. So that's the place we're going. I'm sorry for the parents who are currently here. I'll do what I can about providing you with the resources available that you can get diagnoses and get effective treatments for your kids and get the court orders for those. This is child abuse. This is not a custody issue. But until we get motivation from the mental health people to actually be competent and apply knowledge, until they're motivated to solve things, nothing gets solved. That's a fact. So with that, I'm going to head off to my Sunday and hopefully get around to some YouTube videos on treatment. And I'll break down what the treatment would be if you could find it. So good luck out there, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.